Wilcox. I'm a journalist, but as an international journalist, I'm continually surprised by my own ignorance about certain issues. For example, I wasn't really clear what megacities were until I looked into it. Megacities, metropolitan areas with more than 10 million people. The world has 27 of them, or they did in 2010. By 2020, it's expected there'll be 40. Megacities encompass the architecturally coherent, energy efficient, culturally vibrant urban cores of, for example, think of New York or London or Tokyo, what we like to think of as major cities. But they also include places like Mexico and other cities like that, the sprawl, the slums, the suburbs. In 2010, so 7 years ago, just under 7% of human beings lived in a megacity. That number is going to go up. But can megacities save the world? According to the international architect and designer Lord Foster, the future of the city is the future of our society. And with me on stage today, two men who can probably explain that in more detail than many others. George Berbari is one of the world's leading experts on design and highly efficient energy systems, whose latest book, The Energy Budget, wrote that humanity is helpless in curbing fossil fuel-generated energy use, but through his own model, he believes that we can win the battle against global warming. Dr Parag Khanna, global strategist, who writes in his latest book, Connectography, that we are moving into an era where cities will matter more than states and supply chains will be a more important source of power than militaries. The main purpose will be to protect supply chains rather than borders. Competitive connectivity is the arms race, you say, of the 21st century. I'd like to start just by asking both of you whether you think Lord Foster is right, that the future of the city is the future of our society.
In the sense that, of course, if the majority of the world's population already lives in cities, and if 70 to 75% of the world's population is going to be living in cities by the year 2030, then logically, yes, the future of humanity, meaning people, is physically embodied in life in the city. But of course, life in the city depends on extracting resources from the rest of the planet. This is the phenomenon that scholars call planetary urbanization. What they mean by planetary urbanization is not that there's more and more cities all over the world, because the total land area occupied by our megacities is less than 5% of the surface area of the world. What they mean by planetary urbanization is that wherever cities are, they have such an enormous metabolism and consumption and gravity that they are, through these invisible supply chain tentacles, reaching out and changing the patterns of life, of the ecosystems, of everything in the non-city areas, which is most of the planet. So, it's deep into the Amazon, into the deserts, into the Arctic. Everywhere you go, you can trace the impact of the cities that are on the other side of the world. So yes, the future of where man is the city, but those cities are really driving the future of everything else as well.
Which is where very much, George, you come into this as well, in terms of the energy efficiency and the positives and the negatives of existing megacities.
Today, our cities are probably one of the most inefficient places to live. And they have to be redesigned. We will not destroy them. They have to evolve, and they have to evolve quickly into a sustainable, environmentally friendly way where they are not hurting the environment as much as we are doing today. And the remodeling of that city, not only on energy, but the supply chain, where now we're going to grow food vertically above the city. We're going to have around it wind turbine and solar energy, and between the wind turbine, we're going to have organic farming, and we're going to start penalizing beef and rice and everything that produce methane. So the city have to evolve.
But the pace of change is extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, what took Europe 200 years, 300 years or longer, in China is taking 20, or in India as well. Are we getting the model right in terms of creating these new megacities and in terms of their self-sustainability and quality of life for people?
There's no universal answer, because megacities, which again are defined either by their demographic size, more than 10 million people, or their footprint geographically. And I refer to megacities really as urban archipelagos. And the reason I do that is because on conventional maps, all cities are the same size little black dots. Whereas in reality, a Mexico City or a Sao Paulo or a Jakarta stretches tens of, if not hundreds of kilometers really from one end to the other. So they're really archipelagos of just built up urban development. Now when you say, are we designing our building? I think George's point is exactly, we are not designing them. They are happening because of the pace of urbanization far outstrips the planning capacity, the investment, the technology inputs that would make these places ready by design for all these people. So the answer, as I said, is not universal, it's country by country. There are places like China that pre-build ahead of demand. That's why you have ghost cities, right? Because they anticipate that one day people will live there, but they're not even there yet. And that makes for some spooky reportage, which you can kind of watch on YouTube. But those aren't built to be sustainable cities either. They're just concrete jungles without people yet. There's very few mega cities where or there's probably no mega city, again, more than 10 million people, where you would say, oh yes, this place is designed so well, and 10 people are living in an efficient, or 10 million people are living in an efficient transportation environment with low emissions and widespread public transportation, and there's low inequality. That place doesn't exist.
George, surely the problem is that if you create all your cycleways, your rapid transport systems, your libraries and your schools, that's fine in the nucleus of the city, but you're always going to have people who are going to want to commute in. And surely the whole efficiency of something like that is then negated by the fact that people are expending even more energy getting into the main city itself.
I will answer that in a minute. There is an analogy between the car industry and the building industry. They say the car industry managed to form strong companies, 20 companies, consolidate their business, and invest 5% of the research. And building industry is so fragmented that very little research has been done. And that's why they are not evolving as fast as we want. In cars, we see evolution, major one, every 5 years. In building, it's more static, and they are not evolving to where we want them to be. Now, regarding the commuting, there is a nice sample of the word Melbourne, where they were finding people commuting to have business in the city center and going back to the outskirts of the city. And they found that model was failing, and the city center at night was empty. So the mayor there decided to remix the buildings in the city, where some of the office buildings were transferred into residences and created that mix. And now they have a vibrant city center, and they have also a nice suburbs. Mind you, the suburb with low density has proven to be very expensive in terms of infrastructure and upkeeping. That's one of the main failure of US. It's low density, very spread, very expensive infrastructure to keep.
Okay, now you mentioned the word density. Does density always equal efficiency? Presumably, Parag, with a large tenement block with 100 flats or 200 flats, that is more efficient in terms of heating and everything else than 100 different homes, or is it?
No, that actually depends very much on the sort of technological inputs, on the consumption of electricity and air conditioning and heating in that block and so forth. And George knows all of the technical ways in which you would measure to what extent. Generally speaking, though, we would like to believe that more dense urban environments, if you have the mobility systems to accommodate those people, would be more efficient, because that's X number of thousands of people who are not driving their own cars. They're taking trams and subways and so forth. But again, in most places in the world, you have very dense cities and so forth, but you don't have that public transportation. So a corollary to what George has said that I think is very important is not only having mixed use developments, but also this clusterization phenomenon. The thing about megacities, just remember that if you come from the Western world, the largest cities of the West are Los Angeles, New York, London, and Moscow. We're talking about 10 to 15 million people. In Asia, your megacities could have anywhere from 30 to 60 million people in this broader urban kind of area. So there's an order of magnitude difference there. So when it comes to, it's not only about having mixed-use developments within those Asian megacities, there's no such thing as just, or you cannot have just one downtown business district, as George was saying. One downtown business district works for, say, Wall Street in New York. When you go to Jakarta, right, or you go to other cities, let's just take Cairo, which is a megacity. You need to be thinking about having 4 different business districts, right? Because you can't have, with 20, 30 million people, everyone who does business going to one business. It's a whole new plan, a whole new mega master
And you
plan.
also need to set aside about 4 hours to get there as well in Cairo.
Well, the thing is, you would. I mean, it's, I rank cities by how many meetings you can have in a day, realistically, given their traffic. And, some places do improve. There is improvement in places. New Delhi used to be like a 1 meeting a day kind of town. Now New Delhi is like, you can even do 3 meetings in a day if you take the metro and plan your commute accordingly. But just remember that you want to reimagine the megacity, or rather, let's not be too lofty about it, given the poverty in these places. You just want to fix them in some way incrementally. It means that you want to actually seed these new business areas that dissipate people away from the one main district. And that's also that's hugely important just for economic growth and development and modernization and diversifying the economy.
Can we just focus a little bit now just on energy and district energy, which you talk about in your book, and energy consumption and energy storage? George, just talk us through the various trends now. I mean, one fact that caught my eye a couple of days ago in the British press was that our carbon consumption is now lower than it was in Victorian times, because there's been this great drop in the use of coal in favour of gas and things like that. Now, presumably that's a good thing, but where is the trend going? And let's bring in, for example, solar, and where we are now.
Despite the big boom in solar energy, because now it's cheaper than traditional power, but we are challenged with storage. But the prediction, let's talk from now till 2030, we're supposed to reduce emission by 60%. We are anticipating 15 to 20% increase in electricity consumption. If Europe is doing well, there is massive electrification happening in Africa and in China and the Far East. Actually, China committed to peak out in 2030. So they are planning
to peak out from what base now?
From today. So they are planning another 60% increase before they're gonna start reducing. So
okay.
everything.
But is that power? Is that coal-based power, or what is it? Because Xi Jinping, I thought, with the Great Leap Forward, has committed more money than any other country to green energy.
But it also has more people and faster urbanization and wealth creation, so electricity demand is skyrocketing.
Okay, but in terms of the production, is it hydroelectric, or is it a mix? Is it a real mixture?
No, there's real diversification going on. I was at a meeting recently in Beijing where Chinese asset managers, pension funds, and state-owned companies were expressing concern about the enormous value of stranded assets on their books. Which means they have these coal-fired power plants and even oil and gas pipelines that they've built and invested in that aren't really going to be used, because some provinces, again, of the 30 provinces of China, we're talking about maybe a dozen of them, but a dozen have made fairly significant improvements in using nuclear, hydro, and others, such that they have those stranded assets of hydrocarbons and of fossil fuels that they're not going to need. So there's progress actually being made in some areas.
Tim, the current model, where the city and its administration are taking a back step and having no control on the energy that the city consumes, is failing. And I'm saying what the energy budget is called. It's saying this has to stop. Utility cannot sell to the end user and let him spend as much as he wants, as long as he's paying for it. That model is leading to this disaster.
Well, yeah, but then how do you impose energy consumption on people unless you're living in a totalitarian
Look what
state?
the energy budget is calling, saying the city should buy its own distribution of all the energy, water, sewage within the city, and should ask the utility to bid from outside the city. So you can buy from 100 utility, and they can buy it cheaper, and they can impose solar energy buyout. Then they will appoint one metering company that will not do the duplication for electricity, water, gas, and district energy, but we will cut duplication and will have one doing the metering, and the metering will be done in such a manner where it will measure it per square meter or per capita. And if you are consuming lower, it means that you are efficient, you will be rewarded with lower rate. And if you are inefficient, you will have higher rates. And these additional income, which comes to billions and billions of dollars, will be utilized by the city to invest in retrofitting existing inefficient building, putting district energy, investing in public transport, investing in renewables and organic farming.
But can you see that as a political winner? I mean, I can't. That's a sort of dystopian, totalitarian, imposed, state-down, nanny, I mean, everything, certainly.
You know, as an engineer, I always offered my clients choices. Right now, this is not on the menu. I thought about the book. I spent 31 years in energy and I'm still illiterate. I was educating myself. It's so complex of a subject that you cannot expect a mayor who is most of the time a lawyer or a public administrator to understand this complex subject. This should not be left to politicians.
Jury?
Absolutely.
So what do you do? Do you have an election for an energy czar?
No, what I'm calling is like you have a central bank government, the governor for a central bank or finance. I'm calling in the book to have a governor for energy, like Department of Energy, to have the authority to be independent of politicians, and for him to put the policy.
I mean, your big love affair seems to be with hydrogen, the greenest of all. Where are we in terms of hydrogen? Because the only byproduct of hydrogen is water, isn't it?
Correct.
And there are planes which are being developed, I think, using hydrogen as well. Where are we in terms of megacities, global planning, the greenest source of all?
Hydrogen has been the most controversial fuel. Some of the people wrote books about the wasteful economy 10, 15 years ago. Today we found ways of producing hydrogen more efficiently. It's underway. And the second thing, producing water more efficiently. Because a country like now, they managed to put the largest desalination plant on the Mediterranean, which is our neighbor, at a cost of 60 cents US cent per cubic meter. Here it's costing $2.
Okay, right.
So it's one third of
that's a
what
significant.
and that's becoming lower than treating fresh water. So, and we're going in that direction. Hydrogen, you heard last month, a huge council was announced by mega companies. And they committed to spend $10 billion. These companies are Engie, Alstom, BMW, Mercedes, Toyota, Hyundai, also Air Liquide, the people who want to liquefy that. And they are seeing a future where, if you read their book, they are developing at all levels in production of hydrogen, in the supply chain of hydrogen, in the pipeline of hydrogen, in the fuel cell and reciprocating engine. We're gonna see a disruptive energy, a disruptive technology in 10 years period, where hydrogen will play a mega role in our future.
But of course, hydrogen has been around. It was the Heidelberg, wasn't it? I think the airship.
Sure.
So it's been around since the 30s. I can't remember what year that was. But how will hydrogen transform cities? In what capacity can you use hydrogen? For heating and everything else.
Transport and CHP, combined heating and power. So you produce electricity using a fuel cell, and it has an efficiency of 50%, and you take heat recovery, you reach 90% efficiency, and you use that heat to heat buildings. The second thing about hydrogen, which is good to know, liquid hydrogen is used now to propel rockets. Aeroplanes standardize in kerosene, not diesel, because it has 10% higher energy per kilogram, while liquid hydrogen in aeroplane has 4 times the energy of kerosene. So it tells you the potential of future hydrogen. The second thing, this country we are talking in the GCC post-oil era. I believe because of the solar belts that we have here, we're gonna start exporting liquid nitrogen instead of oil and liquefied natural gas. This will be the future export of the Gulf countries.
Okay, so that's a good thing in terms of climate, but the post-oil world is going to lead to political upheaval potentially and more conflict, isn't it? So isn't it a balance between?
I have some good news and some bad news for you. There isn't a post-oil world that any of us are going to live to see. It's been much touted over the years, over the decades. World oil consumption is still nearly 100 million barrels per day.
But is that because the manufacturing process uses so much?
So that's the demand side of the equation, and of course on the supply side, oil production is, or oil reserves are plentiful, right, because of the U.S. shale energy revolution. Countries that are coming on stream again after many years, like Iran and so forth. So prices are low, and when prices are low, demand tends to remain steady, and then there's an economic recovery underway. I do strongly endorse the transition, diversification, all kinds of alternatives and renewables, which will exist at different proportions of energy production. I mean, look at a large industrial country like Germany that has done so much with wind, for example, and even solar, even though it's not a particularly sunny place. They've invested in these technologies. It can be done, but that composition, Germany's rate, or what China is trying to do with nuclear, hydro, and others, is again, every country will have a different degree, but that doesn't eliminate oil and gas from the picture by any means.
Is something changed on the sound? Are we losing Parag? Can you all hear? Okay. No, that's right. I think you're. Yeah, thank you. It's gone there.
There we go.
Okay, let's look at some of the negatives, though, of megacities. So they produce 15% of world's GDP, but they generate 13% of the world's rubbish. Okay. Now, are we efficiently using that rubbish to create energy?
Some modern cities are doing so. The older cities are not doing that. I have a friend here who's doing recycling and rubbish treatment, let's say. He's taking it free from the municipality. He's renting land, and yet recycling the waste is making him some money.
Okay.
So there are a lot of money to be made out of rubbish. Right now, take steel, 60% is recyclable, aluminum is recyclable, glass is recyclable. You can make it. It's in the,
but what's the cost analysis though of doing that whole process? And if you are recycling steel, for example, the redundant oil rigs, for example, presumably they are recyclable, but the cost of actually floating them inshore?
There's a market for everything. I mean, look at ships. Decommissioned ships are torn up for scrap all the time. It's actually a large global industry, and countries at the bottom of the kind of value chain compete for that, like Bangladesh and others. So there is a process for all of these things, and there is money in it incrementally. But I think George is right. So there's a combination of the technology and the policy. On the technology side, just like in hydrogen, we'll see quantum leaps. We will also in biomass and waste energy. There's a lot of R&D going on in this area. There's also a lot of very successful startups. India is a place, a poor country, where there's a lot of experiments and even local sort of utilization, implementation of waste to energy kinds of programs in biomass, and a lot of startups in that area, which are quite promising. And that too can be a revolution for many, many countries, especially think about rural areas that are becoming wealthier, but the infrastructure is still very poor. They may be able to have the kinds of local solutions that George is talking about for the city, but also for rural areas. And then there's the policy. I mean, it's about, do you incentivize it? I mean, recycling, maybe maybe you don't take it for granted here. This is not, Geneva, right, where you get penalized for every little thing that's not sorted properly into the right labeled bin.
Well, you're publicly humiliated, aren't you?
Yeah, and there's that,
yeah,
right? So again, that's part of the policy in a way, or at least the social code. That's, again, Geneva is not exactly the world, right? We've got a long way to go before we do even the low-hanging fruit that doesn't require a whole lot of new, flashy, experimental technology. Just recycling, right? Even most rich cities in the world, George, you may know, what percentage of the potential rubbish do they even filter, sort, and recycle the way they could? It's probably embarrassingly low.
Do you happen to know?
Yeah, they are embarrassingly low as well. I think really we have to do more proper sorting. Even we, our engineering company, we put recyclable bin, and I saw a lot of things thrown in it that are not recyclable. So there is kind of education, and I think technology will interfere here. Probably, as you can see in a mega city, garbage chutes that are intelligent, that can automatically sort rubbish in the future or detect before you put.
Is something like methane, is that used in terms of creating energy? I'm just thinking about big landfill sites, for example, in the UK, which is producing this massive amount of methane. Is there a way of capturing that, almost like a carbon storage system, and using that? And just on that point, just share what we were talking about, methane creation, because we all know about belching cows. If we got rid of all the cows in Europe, our methane levels would go right down. But there's another.
We have to educate ourselves first. Today we are emitting 52 gigaton of emission. Around 32 to 34 are energy-related CO2, and around 22 are methane-related. Methane has global warming potential 23 times more than carbon. Now, it's a big chunk. That's related to our food. Let's talk beef. Beef produces 36 kilograms of CO2 compared to 4 kilograms of chicken. The surprise, rice comes second after beef. Cows in the world produce more emissions than the entire car fleet. Next to it comes rice, because it is, we cover it with water, we cut oxygen, and it's the only produce that produce methane. So in a mega city, don't we have in the future to tax beef, dairy product, and rice, and any product that produce methane? Of course, now when you go to the landfill, if we take methane, CH4, and burn it, we will have CO2 and H2O. It will be less harmful to the environment. Once we capture, we harvest energy, and we transform it into less harmful gas, because CO2 is 1/23 the global warming potential of methane.
Okay. Where do we do all these messy, nasty, dirty jobs as well? Does that have to be done within the city, or can that be farmed out somewhere else and then sort of the energy piped back in? What's the best way of doing it? Parag?
When you say the messy, dirty jobs, you mean of creating energy out of these sources?
Sewage or garbage.
Right now, it's obviously being external. Well, it's not entirely true. It's being sort of external. I mean, as I think again, Dubai residents know, when you drive out past the sort of what's the Dragon Mart, you see these huge landfills. I think out here, and so that you could call externalizing. But in many, mega cities, there are dumps within the city, many of them. And what's happened in a place like Mumbai, if you go to the famous Dharavi slum of Mumbai, I spent a day there once and I looked at their recycling operation. And that was just entrepreneurialism emerging from the fact that that area where 1 million people live is actually itself simultaneously a trash heap, a landfill. So I don't think that there is some kind of conscious strategy yet that all cities have. Every city is doing this differently, but perhaps what they have in common is that they don't have a sustainable strategy around where they locate their waste and how they sort their waste and how they potentially turn it into energy to basically expand the life cycle of materials.
Okay, so just going back to the megacity point of view, presumably life expectancy and longevity, normally if you look at the stats, is higher because you are closer to resources and doctors. things like that. What's the next phase, George, do you think, for these emerging megacities? Since they're going to increase significantly over the next 20, 30 years.
Religious house that might be used by many religions as efficiency of usage.
What, so a mosque with a synagogue?
Possible.
The Spanish used to just build cathedrals over mosques.
If you take Christianity, there's 16 sects. Let's start within each. Christianity has 16 sects. Each one has a church. Right. And take Islam, or if you have 3-4 sects, each one has a mosque. Judaism has a separate division. Hinduism has also as well. Even that, if we can reduce these and we can having polyvalent rooms in a city for multiple use, you can have a party, a nightclub, then you can have a civilized discussion or auditorium. These multi-purpose places will evolve in the city and help faster medical response as well, because it's closer.
The first thing that has to happen actually is affordable housing. So if there's one common federal municipal priority in every single country in the entire world, rich and poor, east and west, north and south, it's affordable housing. It's perhaps the only thing the urban world truly has in common. The one challenge that's shared across the world is affordable housing. It's a problem in London, it's a problem in Nigeria, it's a problem literally everywhere. And I think that there are places that have revolutions over it and those that figure it out, right? And it's not really hard to figure out. It's about land policy, regulation, corruption, fiscal expense, and so forth. And it's obviously well documented that once people have a roof over their heads affordably, where they don't have to spend 40+% of their disposable income on habitation, then they can be more productive members of society, they can be consumers, they can drive economic growth. So there's no argument, no rational argument against making that the number one priority, and it's not being done in most places. And again, it's a complaint you hear in Johannesburg, it's a complaint you hear in London too. That's one. Another is water, right? I mean, fresh water supply. You mentioned Mexico City in your opening remarks. There are many megacities that have falling water tables right now from horrendous overconsumption. You even have megacities in resource-rich countries like Sao Paulo, where you turn on the tap and there is no water coming out because they've actually, through deforestation, they've messed up their reservoir systems and aquifers, and the water is no longer actually getting into the pipes to get into the city. So water is an equally important priority. These are the basics of survival that we need to be focused on. And again, there's only, you can count them on a few hands, the number of these megacities in the world. We could literally talk about them one by one and say, where on a scale of 0 to 10 is this city on any of the 5 or 6 principal challenges? And
do you want to do that?
Right now, it wouldn't be encouraging. I mean, I do that all the time. But,
okay, let's look at the four cities and where they are.
Which cities?
Yeah, the cities you were saying.
I meant 40 cities.
Oh, so 40.
Yeah, because like you said, there are about 40 megacities, and there's at least the obvious priorities. I think again, it's the housing, it's the mobility, transportation, it's the water resources, and so.
But something, George, like
energy.
Water, I mean, is that recoverable? I mean, if you've exhausted all those supplies, how are you going to recreate that?
In 10 years, nobody will talk about water anymore, because we will have the technology to produce it from sea, which is 99% of the cheaper than treating river water. Today, in mega cities, for example, that are starving, like Riyadh, they were wasting 1 million cubic meter a day on sewage. They invested 7 years ago, and they start recycling that. In Singapore, where Parag now live, they have recycled the sewage water into drinkable water, and they call it new water.
You call it what?
New water.
New water.
NU, yes, like represent you. And people have no issue in drinking it. Here.
No, not at all. In fact, just to back up George's point about having a czar, of the city, I've actually told the Singaporean government that for brand value, they should actually ban bottled water and then only distribute this new water, because the new water is perfectly fine. They use it in all public facilities. And obviously tested it. My children, for their class trips, they go to the new water facility. They've really hit upon a technological solution, and they should actually change the market incentives to encourage this, because I hope everyone has at some point read or seen an infomercial or a graphic about the supply chain of producing a bottle of Perrier. Right? Think about the glass, think about the water and all this. I mean, the branding, it's ludicrous. There's few things more polluting in your daily life than a glass bottle of Perrier. It's ridiculous. So, we should not have to wait until push comes to shove and and people are fighting over water to be spending what we need to spend on these critical desalination and other technologies.
With the emerging megacities, does that make it more expensive for people who don't want to live in a megacity? They want to be away in the countryside away. I mean, is life going to be more expensive and more difficult for these people because the emphasis is going to be put on megacities?
No, economic resources go into the cities because they're also the economic drivers and the demographic hubs, but that doesn't make it really a self-fulfilling prophecy yet, because again, people are coming into cities faster than governments are anticipating it, right? So just because the megacity is there, it doesn't mean that it's sort of, again, by design. And also, people move to cities, as you said earlier, to have access to those resources, to be able to reach a health clinic, to maybe get an education, to buy a mobile phone, to get a job, to send money back to their families in rural areas. The largest internal domestic remittance market in the world is, of course, China, right? People live in coastal China, they send money back now very seamlessly through mobile payments and so forth. So it's not, there's a sort of virtuous cycle there that does in fact benefit the rest of the country, even if it seems like we're only focusing on the city.
Okay, just a little pick up on that.
I'm an engineer. He picked on low-cost housing, and you picked on people who want to live outside. There are two types. People who want to have low terrace, single house with a garden, and there are people who are looking for low-cost housing that now, like government of Singapore, are putting outside the suburb, high-rise, small apartments that are cheaper. Dubai also, we're putting them outside, and we are putting now, we love villas and our gardens. So these are the two main types that people, the upper middle class and rich go for villas, and middle class and lower in a city go for multi-story away housing. So these, both of them create a challenge of connectivity, which Parag is talking. How are we going to bring them to the city? And we see our roads are flooded. Today, we are going to have what we are evolving is self-driving cars that can form chain. So we have to design our cars so that our current road, because we cannot increase the roads in megacities. We cannot make them wider. We can either build double story or change the design of the car where we interlink them. The self-driving car and the shared car where you don't buy cars anymore. The third one, which I envisage, is that to have a cable car that goes above the city and take you above the traffic. And then they're gonna have the flying machine or flying drones or
drone taxi.
Taxi.
Well,
So-
we're not too far away, are we, actually? Potentially.
There's a couple of European cities apparently that are looking at sort of deregulating some small-scale experiments around sort of self-piloted aircraft for local transport.
Just before we go to the floor, looking at the Dubai skyline, for example, so many of these amazing designed buildings, but presumably pretty energy inefficient. I mean, there's so much glass out there. How are you going to correct that as well if you've got a skyscraper with, I don't know, 80 floors or something, made of glass, and just not being an efficient building?
Most of the designs that came here from Europe or US came from places where the sun play a positive role in winter, especially in offices. While here in the tropical countries, the sun or glass always play negative role and pass 10 times more energy than insulated wall. So we have an obsession in glass that we need to curb. I gave an example of Oman, Muscat, where they have traditional building and much less glass. They consume per capita quarter of Dubai, Qatar, and Kuwait, and half of Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, just because the way we build buildings. And put that on LinkedIn if you want to see these articles.
So actually you've got to attack the sort of testosterone-led architectural sort of egocentricity perhaps of architects, or change public perceptions of what they think is attractive.
I mean, someone had to hire them, remember, so that we don't have to blame the architects per se. It's has a lot to do with the motivation behind hiring them in the first place. How much of a again a sort of integrated, sustainable design was preconceived in the first place, and then what place do certain landmarks fit into it?
Okay, just before we go to the floor, the public will is here to pay for this. The leadership is here as well to actually create a much healthier, much better sort of environment for people over the next 100, 200 years.
The book which I wrote create a self-financing mechanism and generate billions of dollars to finance this. So the public actually is more committed than the government to do so.
I agree. People are the ones who live on the ground. Literally, they have a sense of what their priorities are, and quality of life matters immensely. And I think if people were designing their own cities, so to speak, they would design them a lot better and differently than they are being designed right now, without a doubt. When 60,000 people go to a sporting event, technically they become more vulnerable to some kind of disruption or event that may occur. So we're doing that on a permanent scale in the sense that everyone is moving into megacities. So resilience becomes a very important buzzword. So it could be the spread of a deadly pathogen or something. And we've seen this in the last 10, 15 years, whether it's bird flu or other kinds of viruses. We've seen them quickly spread through aviation corridors and so forth. But we've been very quickly able to ring fence, if you will, the origin of these diseases, and to more or less contain the sort of spread. But there are some things that we can't control, like earthquakes, for example. We may have also locked in a certain amount of sea level rise, given where temperature rise has already sort of taken us. And that could mean rising for the equatorial latitudes in the megacities of Asia that are around the equator and the Pacific Rim. So I think that perhaps the biggest threat in all of the risks that you're alluding to in the long term is coastal of Asian megacities, which are, again, the largest cities, the largest population concentration of the 8 billion people in the world is really around the Pacific Rim of Asia, and those are mostly coastal megacities. And that concentration and migration is happening exactly as sea levels are rising, and that may well be locked in. So your tsunami risk, your coastal surge risk is all going up. That would be number 1 through 10 in terms of the existential risk to ourselves that we've created, actually. And other things, of course, city by city, there's a lot of efforts underway at resilience and a lot of initiatives that are trying to help cities to cope either with inequality and crime or all of the other kinds of sort of negative externalities that result from having very high density and resource consumption and poverty all confined into one place. I think it's very clear it can be solved. This is the result of obviously, gentrification is not just something that organically happens. It's regulatorily encouraged by the way in which land rights for development are granted, the costs that are allowed for certain properties, the design of those properties in terms of who can live there and who can afford to live there, and that pushes people out, and that causes the commuting jams. None of this is an accident. This is a result of poor planning. In many places, it's the result of corruption. There's many very human and secular and political causes of this, and anything that we have caused, we can also fix. And that's why some governments, if they're smart, if they're progressive, are demanding that there be mixed income or affordable housing built into various projects. This is happening in New York City right now. In New York City, they've also said enough is enough, and a new mayor has increased the requirements for affordable housing to be integrated into new development projects.
Yeah, but have you actually looked at what the parameters are for affordable housing? I've just had to buy a flat recently that I moved, but the affordable housing there, I think in London, is a salary, anyone on a salary of up to £60,000.
Again, I'm also not saying
I can't think of any nurses.
I'm not saying it's good enough.
£60,000.
I'm not saying it's good enough. I'm not saying it's being done right. I'm saying that there are solutions, and if you, George gave the example of Singapore. Again, going back 50, 60 years, they said everyone's going to own their own flat. It's going to basically either you'll have mandatory savings that will pay for it in small but very affordable increments, or if you cannot afford it, it will simply be given to you. And that's a policy that they maintain to this day, but they only have 5 million people. You can't do that in a poor country that has tens of millions of people. But there is no country, no city in the world where you could not, if you had the czar, if George and I were the co-mayors.
This is what is terrifying.
I'm sorry, but you would have to name me a city. And we would both tell you, we would look at a map of the city and we would tell you how you would solve that problem.
You answer that same question as well, George, because what it surely means is more bureaucracy, more rules, less freedom of movement and more sort of market control. The free market is then taken away. I mean, that's the political trade-off for a lot of this, isn't it?
George, tiny, it's not a free market. Sorry, the reason you have these problems is because because in most cities, because land is so valuable and because there's such distortions and power imbalances and who has money and who gets to do certain kinds of development, it's not a free market. It's entirely rigged.
Okay, so in other words, it's a societal...
Why would you rig yourself?
I'm putting questions. George.
Again, we always presented practical solutions. That's what energy is. This is a problem. So where are the affordable housing? They go to the suburb where land is much cheaper, much cheaper. And they build high rises that cost much less per square meter so that you can make them affordable housing. Now, the gentleman mentioned about transport and traffic. And this is where the government has to come and resolve this. I mean, to do low-cost housing and not have a solution for public transport.
But most governments are broke. All over the world.
That's true, and this is where we have to change to self-financing mechanism, because these systems can self-finance themselves, and engaging the private sector and the public-private partnership will resolve it. I'll tell you, for every $1 opportunity of investment, there are $10 waiting. You don't believe how much private money is begging for opportunity to invest in these projects. It's unbelievable.
So I think you've definitely hit upon some examples. There are cities around the world like Tokyo, Hong Kong, New York, Seattle, elsewhere, where you've already had a re-regulation to allow for these micro-pod apartments. They've already been built in many cases. People are moving in. They get to, live cheaper, but you're living in you're like the size of this box, tiny. Your bed is a tray, and this is the new affordable housing, these micro apartments. Some of it is actually publicly subsidized, some of it is new private developers that are doing this in order to cater to a generation of young people that is never going to get married or getting married late, doesn't want to have kids, may never have kids, is obviously financially very insecure. And not every country is like this, but certainly Western countries are like this, and Asian cities with very high cost basis are like this. And I don't know if that's a band-aid or not, it's a new reality.
I have one info there, that the average size of the American home has grew up by 30% in the last 40 years and consuming same amount of energy. So the general trend is for bigger housing, despite many of these mini ones are being built.
two kinds of revolutions that will change the way we think of this. I think George represents the technological revolution standpoint, where the cost of doing the right thing for a large number of people becomes feasible, affordable, and I think that's very true. If we can simply invest in the technology transfer, mechanisms to make it possible. And again, there's the capital markets are begging to invest in this sort of stuff, and so I actually think that market forces are helping large cities, even in poor countries, adapt faster than we certainly thought they would, and that's because of the technology. Second kind of revolution I want to talk about is the political one. Right, because you now have armed gangs of anti-gentrification activists that are terrorizing, neighborhoods, whether it is in Istanbul or in South Africa, in Johannesburg and elsewhere. So there's nothing quite like, a political hostage-taking combined with Occupy Wall Street and the other kinds of just fed-up movements that you're seeing sprout around the world to get governments and wake up and make a priority out of basic human, necessities like affordable housing. So I actually have faith in the people, if you will, that they're going to, that they see the distortions, they see the corruption, and they are standing up, and that's going to change policies.
Okay, George, just
there were, the last word on this, there were a documentary on BBC, How Building Learned, and they found that the architect envisaged 6-7 models, and they went to the building after, and they saw the people living in this building doing 100 different models, nothing to do with the architect vision. So today, our detachment of architecture from people, despite what you learn in school, is so big. Here in Dubai, none of us moving to a building except finding 100 problems. Architects want to do it fast. They have little time. They don't go revisit project after they're finished because they're not being paid. So we have an issue with the detachment of architecture from people, not the reverse one. What you are claiming that you build for people. And we have to address that, probably in our education system.
So I'm afraid time is up. I just want to thank Emirates Airline, Dubai Culture, and everyone responsible for this fantastic festival. Thank you all for your questions, and thank you both very much indeed.